Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today we're going to have a little bit of a deep dive on perhaps one of the greatest and unfortunately unfinished campaigns that Games Workshop have ever released. You see, many of you are familiar with Tamurkhan, the Throne of Chaos. This was a Forgeworld release which was a rather large campaign. It introduced a bunch of miniatures, not just for the Chaos factions but a few other ones too. And, yeah, it was fairly expensive to get into. Anything that was Forgeworld, or Warhammer Forge as it was called back in the day too, was something that a lot of people just wouldn't really buy, considering how Forgeworld was. But back in the day, if you wanted the best looking miniatures and you wanted some new stuff to flesh out your armies, perhaps some new demons, or some new characters, some of the best looking casts ever produced, Forgeworld was the way to go, and you knew if you had someone who would bring one of those units into their army list, that they either had a lot of money, or they were just very generally dedicated to their hobby, or both. But anyways, before we actually jump into the story, what is Tamurkhan? This is the thing. What is the Throne of Chaos? This was a campaign that was supposed to be a 4-book series, each centered around 4 different gods. Liner notes of the book itself also confirmed that this was supposed to be a 4-book series, but unfortunately, given how things went with Warhammer Fantasy, mismanagement was a very big thing with Games Workshop back in the day, we unfortunately never saw its full release, but a lot of Forgeworld stuff actually just got introduced, a lot of stuff was confirmed, not just hinted but confirmed, and then just never saw the light of day. The general setting was that there was once a great Kurgan in the north. This is in the northern parts of the Warhammer Fantasy world near Grand Cafe, and he sired 4 children. Each of those children were taken away from him from the very Chaos Gods themselves, and they were blessed with very powerful magics. This would have been a way to advance the story, but without having an Ever-Chosen rise up, but the strength would mirror that of a Ever-Chosen's crusade, but just in a weaker sense. Unfortunately, we only have one confirmed son in the story, which we're going to talk about just now, but there might have been a second, which will also feature in this video. The first son and the only confirmed son was that of Tamurkhan, and you're seeing this great creature on screen. He's riding a toad dragon. That's not even Tamurkhan, not even the rider, which you can see as a plague ogre, but in fact, Tamurkhan is much smaller. He is a maggot. He is the maggot lord. It would seem that the child had been blessed so much that he had shrunk in size and is acting more as a parasitic creature. As anyone that he does fight, he can take over their body and literally take over their body, warping them into a being of chaos, and that's how he continues to survive throughout the Warhammer world. It's a very interesting concept of a parasite being such a great being throughout this world. In a general gist of the story, Tamurkhan would travel to Zanbaijin, defeating many Chaos champions and adding those forces of those champions to his great horde. He would also subjugate some ogre tribes and work alongside some Chaos dwarfs, where he would carve a path of destruction through the Mountains of Morn, through the Darklands, all the way to the Empire, getting eventually defeated and destroyed during the Battle of Null. But as you can tell, this was a rather large campaign. This was a tabletop book, which also had a lot of lore, and it had loads of scenarios. You could easily play through this campaign, and it was really interesting, because yes, Chaos lost, but it advanced the story a little bit. Some characters died, some characters were introduced, but the main thing is that this series introduced a bunch of new units for people to use, a lot of really cool ones. For Nurgle, for example, we had the introduction of Plague Toads. You could have these with riders or just by themselves, demonic creatures, more new demons. They were really cool. I've got a bunch of them myself as I was a very big fan, but these were new demonic creatures which many expected would eventually make their way to a 9th edition army book if we ever had one, which unfortunately we didn't. But you might be familiar with these creatures as they were a base game unit for Total War Warhammer 3's Nurgle roster. Really impressive considering that they were a Forgeworld unit, and those are normally locked behind a DLC. Then we had the Bile Trolls, which were pretty cool, the Plague Ogres. This added in a bunch of new stuff for a Nurgle-themed army, just in case you wanted to have more of a Nurgle theme. Because the great thing about this book was that you could kind of mix up some demons and also some Chaos Warriors, and you could have a proper mono-god Nurgle army. This was before mono-god armies were becoming too much of a thing, and it's something that many people are hoping for in the future with, say for example, Warhammer the Old World, as Age of Sigmar now has monogod themes, and it would be really cool if we could do this and have that, right? yet. Hell, we even have monogod armies with Total War Warhammer 3, which is really a first. There was one extra unit that was introduced for Nurgle known as the Rot Knights, but unfortunately that unit just never had a miniature. This was a big issue with Games Workshop where they would introduce characters, introduce units, but never actually provide a model. Sometimes they would provide concept art, which meant, yes, they were making it, but, you know, time and stuff just never happened. This was a massive issue not just for Warhammer Fantasy, but also for Warhammer 40k. There was actually a rather famous lawsuit for that. It can be assumed that the Rot Knights would have a very similar theme to another character that was introduced there, which was Kha'Zix the Befouled, a really interesting looking character. This is a Nurgle character on a large base because he was riding on a demonic mount. And I wouldn't say no to something like this in the future because, I mean, it looks kind of cool. Sure, it's not that pretty when it's in resin, and when it's painted, you have to make it look pretty good because resin is hard to work with. But yeah, this would have been the Nurgle mortal equivalent to, say, for example, the Khornate Skull Crushers. As a big issue that happened with Warriors of Chaos in 8th edition was that there wasn't really a lot of monogod style units. Yeah, you had the Hellstriders, and yeah, you had the Skull Crushers, but that was pretty much it. And it was a little bit disappointing if you favored one of the other Chaos gods. When it came to the Empire, not too much was added in. It was mostly characters, where we had Elsef von Draken, a rather powerful spellcaster, who may or may not be a vampire in the Empire service. Well, not really the Empire service, she actually works on her own things, but she's more than happy to step in to protect the Empire, knowing full well that if Chaos won, then she'd have to go and find a new home. There were some other things introduced, like the Marienburg Landship, but that was more specific to Marienburg, an independent nation for the Warhammer universe. They had actually broken from the Empire a long time ago. Some cool characters like Theodor Bruckner, which his demigryph, yes, that is a demigryph, is the perfect example that apparently in the Warhammer universe, roids do make you bigger. But then there were some units like the Null Ironsides. These were a handgunner unit, Menan's Blade, which were pretty much just, you know, just frontline units, nothing too special about them, but it introduced a decent amount of things. Keep in mind that this book series was supposed to be centered around Chaos, so all this was supposed to do is introduce some enemies for people to fight, because it would have been a bit boring if the main enemy was Karl Franz and you already had access to him, so you had access to a few units just to be able to play around, right? You had them better, right? Like Null Ironsides were just heavy armor gunners, the Marienburg Landship is basically just a very big steam tank. Very cool though, let's be honest, very, very cool. One of the biggest things, however, about this book was the reintroduction of the Chaos Dwarfs, a faction that had not had an army book for a long, long time now. They had a massive visual update. Obviously, this is the Legion of Asgore. It's still used in Age of Sigmar as far as I know, but I believe it's gone into the Legends section, but it's absolutely massive, and it was probably one of the most stunning kits I'd ever seen. I actually have a Chaos Dwarf army based on this. And this is, as far as I'm aware, the first time Warhammer Fantasy had an army tied to a Forgeworld release. We already had that for 40k at that point because obviously we had specialist units like the Deathcore or Krieg, and that was like a full army. You could actually play full Deathcore, but to the best of my recollection, we didn't really have that for Warhammer Fantasy. And this was a big thing because the Chaos Dwarves were naturally very, very strong. They were one of the strongest armies if you used them correctly, as Forgeworld stuff was always overpowered. You get what you paid for, essentially. But still, this was a very big change. This meant that the Chaos Dwarves were finally back. You could use them in your Tamurkhan list, you could use them mixed up if certain scenarios allowed for that, but you could have a full Chaos Dwarf army if you so wanted. There were some issues there where tournaments would not let the Chaos Dwarfs be used, mostly because, yeah, they were very, very strong. So there were a decent amount of models to play with this book. The story in itself was actually really, really good. I'd say that this is one of the best campaign releases that Games Workshop have ever done, because the story was engaging, the missions were fun. The fact is that this was something massive. People often compared it to the original End Times, on quotes there. This was the Storm of Chaos, which had something very similar, but had pretty good writing, was very, very engaging, and again is one of the better campaigns that Games Workshop have ever released. The story ended with Tamurkhan dying. Spoiler alert, but it's been since like 2011, so yeah, it's been a while. So why didn't the series continue? Well, there's a few reasons why. First up, Games Workshop's marketing for anything Warhammer Fantasy related was absolutely atrocious. It didn't sell as well as Warhammer 40k, so they would market it less. I know a lot of people who just didn't know the book existed. And these were people who were active in the community, but then again, Forgeworld was something that a lot of people just didn't buy into because it was kind of expensive. That's also a big thing. The price of a lot of miniatures was just absolutely massive, so why would you buy Tamurkhan if you're only going to use him for a campaign? Especially since named characters were horrendously overpriced in terms of points, meaning that you would only feel Tamurkhan, Kazik, hell, even some of the big monsters, if you were using a large army. This would be 3,000 points, 4,000 points, anything above that, where the standard was generally around 1,000 to 2,000 points, 2,000 being the general standard that you'll see around YouTube. Named characters have always been an issue. This isn't just because of the Tamurkhan series, but rather because of everything, right? Warhammer Fantasy always had an issue with named characters where it would be cheaper in terms of points to just make your own, and you could even make them better than your general named lord. Thankfully, this is not so much of an issue for Warhammer Age of Sigmar and Warhammer 40,000 now, so it can be assumed that it's not going to be an issue for the Old World either, but it was a massive issue. I had no reason to bring down, say for example, Vankwall, who was very expensive in his own right, when I could bring a Grey Seer down who was cheaper and actually even better. So yeah, between no sales and just general lack of promotion, yeah, the series did not sell and the series was canned. But what happened to the other brothers? This is the main question. You see, there are 4 major powers, and we know that each of them had taken one of the sons to create their own champion. So why is it that we never heard of the other brothers? Where are the other books? The general thought is that they just never had other books because, well, they saw how it was going and they didn't think that it was worth it to actually continue working on this project. However, there are other reasons to think otherwise, and that some of the books might have already been completed, one of them pretty much ready to go, and the others were still in a concept type of making stage. There's been loads of rumours online about this, but it's very possible that the Khornate book was next for one reason. This is Vorgoroth the Scarred, a absolutely powerful Khornate champion, and his gigantic Chaos Dragon mount, like really one of the biggest Chaos Dragons that we've ever seen. Now this character was basically released for Age of Sigmar, and there was pretty much like no context. A lot of lore was given for him. There's actually about 2 full pages of A4 when you bought him alongside his rather detailed construction guide because, yeah, he was not an easy model to build up. Like, you would have to spend a lot of super glue on this as, yeah, a bit complicated. Now you might be saying, this is an Age of Sigmar model, why would this be one of the missing Kurgan sons? Well, his lore that was introduced actually established him as a character that was actually in the Warhammer Fantasy world before Age of Sigmar, which is something that was really, really uncommon unless it was a famous character like Teclis or Tyrion or Malekith, you know, characters that we as a fanbase would have already known and already been attached to in a sense. So why would this nobody for us, right? He was completely unknown. Have a few paragraphs that actually go through that lore. We're going to read over it. Eons ago, upon the world that was, that's the name that the Age of Sigmar setting calls the Warhammer Fantasy world, Vorgoroth was a mere mortal, one of thousands of barbarian warlords who waged war across the northern lands. A fearsome warrior, he would regularly lead the strongest of his people out onto the surrounding plains in the bloodthirsty raids, attacking rival tribes and slaughtering all who dared to stand against them. For his successors on the battlefield, though, Vorgoroth would pay a terrible price. For upon returning from one such raid, the warlord found his settlement had been ravaged by ogres. That's the name for ogres in Age of Sigmar. The corpses of dozens of his family members and followers left strewn amongst the destruction left by the beasts attacked. Blinded by fury, Vorgoroth roared his grief to the heavens, pledging his life and soul to whichever god would grant him retribution. It was no less than the blood god Khorn who answered. A strength and rage the likes of which only a god of war can bestow consumed Vorgoroth's mind and body, and as the red mist of battle fully descended upon him, with axe in hand, the warlord and his remaining warriors set off to hunt down their foe. It did not take long to seek out the ogre tribe, a trail of half-gnawed human bodies betraying the location of their encampment. Storming into their midst, Volgarov and his warriors fought and butchered each and every ogre within, though by the end, not one of Volgarov's warriors had survived. His vengeance complete, the warlord was true to his word, raising the severed head of the ogre tyrant to the skies as tribute. I'm just going to say ogres because ogre just kind of throws me off, I'll be very honest with you. Volgarov pledged his life and his soul to his new master. Pleased with the slaughter enacted in his name, Khorne in turn blessed his new follower with the strength and hulking frame of the tyrant, Volgarov's body twisting and writhing with intense pain as he was transformed. That's all the lore that we know regarding his time in Warhammer Fantasy. The thing is that it kind of parallels Tamurkhan. A big display where then you're blessed even more and then you can become a champion of your chosen god. It's kind of interesting. Obviously Tamurkhan himself was already Nurgle style, but Khorne might have waited for Volgarov just to give him time to actually prove himself before giving some proper blessings out. It's actually kind of funny how Tamurkhan ended up with an ogre tyrant's body, and then this guy ended up with an ogre tyrant's body too. Very, very curious. Although never confirmed, though sometimes hinted by former Games Workshop staff, you can tell that there are a lot of similarities, and yeah, a lot of people did actually think that the Khorne book was next. There were a lot of rumors, very, very close rumors by people who claim to be in the inside or know someone in the inside that was saying, yes, the Khorne book is actually next. And keep in mind that back then, when rumors started coming out, they usually were kind of right if you knew the people that were actually posting about it, as Games Workshop were a lot more open to speak about stuff. There's a reason why, for example, we knew there was a Battle of Skull Pass, the third Battle of Skull Pass, and the book itself just never got released, but there's concept art because Games Workshop used to actively show art out there. Especially during their open days, for example, for Forgeworld or for Games Workshop, there were just really weird times back then because Games Workshop were really actually quite good at communicating, which is a weird thing because they don't do that now. They don't hint towards stuff as often. They do hint, but they don't just flat out say, look, this is what's going to happen next, this is the plan, or if we can, this is going to be the plan. There was even a Khornate Demon Prince, which many people linked up to this character, so many people thought that this might have been the secondary, because Tamurkhan even had a secondary who fought alongside him, so it's very, very possible that this guy would have also been linked up to Volgarov's carnage in his campaign. But that's not all. There were loads of rumors. Rumors from 2011 going all the way up to the end of the end times because people were still discussing the Tamurkhan series. It was popular despite the fact that it didn't sell that much. There were talks that the original plan for this Khornate book was supposed to be Khorne versus Kislev. Yep. Kislev would have been returning as a allied detachment in a sense, very similar to that of the Chaos Dwarfs, that there would already have been a lot of concept designs from back in the day and even some miniatures. Hell, some people nowadays, some longbeards who were back in the day very active in Warhammer Fantasy, believe that a lot of the stuff that we're seeing for Kislev, for Old World and for Warhammer 3 might have been reused and reinterpreted concept arts from way back in the day, as it is entirely possible. Kislev didn't have an army, and well, they never really had an army, but they had something in 6th edition which was a bit of a supplement, but that was an allied detachment, and a lot of people thought that this might be the return of Kislev proper, as Khorne already had a decent amount of attention. There were some lesser rumors that we would have had, say, for example, some armored bloodletters, as one of the heralds for Forgeworld did look a little bit more armored, obviously was better equipped, and there were some rumors that we'd have a new type of bloodletter with additional hand weapons, but those are very, very faint. Hell, at certain points people were talking about a possible flying unit, which would have been very interesting for Khorne. Would have had to be something very, very destructive, but yeah, this is something which I've always thought about, as it's a massive shame that it just never got completed considering, yeah, the fall of Warhammer Fantasy and just how Forgeworld was run back in the day. Forgeworld is still a weird place. It's like if you go in there now, it's mostly empty, as they're making room for Warhammer the Old World, the Age of Sigmar line has basically been removed, and even then, the Age of Sigmar models, barring like one or two, were actually all Warhammer Fantasy things. Stuff that was actually tied to another book that we'll talk about later in another video, but they had releases, and they ended up having like war scrolls in a sense, just to be able to use them, but that's it, really. That's literally it. So that takes us to the two last remaining brothers, one for Tzeentch and one for Slaanesh. Unfortunately, we know nothing. Yeah, it's very disappointing, because if Khorne was next, we wouldn't have heard anything about the Tzeentch or the Slaaneshi characters until after the book was released, which is a massive shame. There were already rumours. Hell, one of the more interesting rumours that I've ever heard kind of makes sense, that Tzeentch would have had what we now have in Warhammer 3, the Doom Knights, because even Games Workshop said that they were never a unit before, and yeah, it would have been something that Tzeentch would have benefited a lot, because Tzeentch didn't have any Tzeentch-style units in the Warriors of Chaos roster. Unfortunately, no word on the Slaanesh one whatsoever, which is a massive shame considering that I'm a big fan of Slaanesh, but you never know for the future. This is the thing, right? While we're going back a few hundred years in Warhammer the Old World, it's not completely out of the question that Games Workshop might repurpose those characters, or give us campaigns set in the future, just change a few things around, and yep, they exist here, right? Because there's nothing really saying that the Old World has to stay in the setting of Magnus the Pious. They could go around to different areas for different campaigns just to introduce new units where it's appropriate for a little bit of story exposition. It'll allow the writers and the developers to have a little bit of fun, as long as it doesn't go past the End Times timeline, because obviously that would mean that the world is already destroyed. There's a lot that could be done, and these units could easily be implemented for Age of Sigmar also, just to give people some bit more variety. The Monogod rosters for Age of Sigmar are actually quite good, but I know some people want a few more units. The last thing would also be, you know, DLC for Total War Warhammer 3, as a lot of people are expecting Tamurkhan. We're expecting Tamurkhan versus Elsef as a Lord pack, as the Throne of Chaos does make a lot of sense to expand on that story and just have a little bit of fun. We've already got a little bit of that with the Champions of Chaos DLC, as it does touch upon Zambijin a little bit. But I wanted to do this video as I've been building up my Chaos Dwarfs recently, right? I've been building up my armies as I've had a lot of the resin Forgeworld Chaos Dwarfs for a while, and I just haven't done anything with them, and I feel like now is the time to start building them, getting them out of the way, as I'm finishing up my Warhammer Fantasy armies. Hopefully, Old World is this year, so I'll have pretty much every possible army to play with. But I've been reading from that story again, and it was really disappointing that we never actually got to see the final 3 parts, just to be able to have context and obviously know about units that we just never really had on the tabletop. Here's hoping Games Workshop will go back and just take stuff that they potentially had planned and release it in the future. It would be great for everyone. But let me know what you guys think about all this. Are there any other rumours that you might have heard, specifically maybe about the Khorne book, the Slaanesh book, and the Tzeentch book? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a bit of a discussion. Until then, have a good day.